This past Wednesday, Pence delivered a speech at St. Anselm College in New Hampshire. And I, like most people, didn't pay attention to it because who's paying attention to Pence in this race after all? But after watching the speech twice now, I'm prepared to say that it may be one of the most. Actually, I will go ahead and say it. It is so far the most important speech by a politician of the 2024 campaign cycle on either side. And I'm going to play some clips from it, and then I'm going to make the case for, first, why it's goofy, but then secondly, why it's of such significance.
I stand before you today as a Republican candidate for President of the United States because I believe this country is in a lot of trouble. Joe Biden has weakened America at home and abroad. And I believe that all of us with the ability and the experience to bring about change have a responsibility to try. We also have an obligation to speak plainly about the challenges our nation is facing. We need new leadership in the White House, and I believe we need new leadership in the Republican Party. But now more than ever, I believe we must forge that new leadership in the Republican Party, grounded on the conservative principles that have defined our movement for more than 50 years. So I came here to Anselm College to simply say from my heart that Republican voters face a choice in this state and in every state around the nation as these primaries unfold. And I believe that choice will determine the fate of our party and the course of our nation for years to come. So today I ask my fellow Republicans this. In the days to come, will we be the party of conservatism, or will we follow the siren song of populism unmoored to conservative principles? The future of this movement and this party belongs to one or the other, not both. That's because the fundamental divide between these two factions is unbridgeable. History teaches that societies with more freedom and less government flourish. That's why we have a brilliant system of checks and balances, divisions of authority, co-equal branches of government, enshrined in our Constitution, and sovereign state governments under our system of federalism. Conservatives understand that in order to advance an agenda on behalf of the American people, we must work through the system, the political home of those who believe in limited government and individual liberty, who keep faith with our Constitution, is the Republican Party. Now, for decades, conservatism's ideological rival has been liberalism, an ideology that has long found favor in the Democratic Party. The radical left has now taken the Democratic Party into the abyss of progressive socialism in the guise of their woke agenda. Where conservatives view government power with great suspicion, progressives wield it eagerly in pursuit of their political goals, especially their massive avalanche of spending and mandates known as the Green New Deal. Another strain of this ideology challenges conservatism not from the Democratic Party, but from within, for control of the Republican Party. It takes the form of what's known as populism rather than progressivism. But make no mistake about it, those ideologies are fellow travelers on the same road to ruin. Now, populist movements have long been a part of the fabric of American politics. They've most often been led by Democrats like William Jennings Bryan, Huey Long, and more recently, Bernie Sanders, and other leftists who share the party's progressivism. But today, a populist movement is rising in the Republican Party. The growing faction would substitute our faith in limited government and traditional values with an agenda stitched together by little else than personal grievances and performative outrage. The Republican populists would abandon American leadership on the world stage, embracing a posture of appeasement in the face of rising threats to freedom. Republican populists would blatantly erode our constitutional norms. A leading candidate for the Republican nomination last year called for the, quote, termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution, close quote. While his imitators in this primary have demonstrated a willingness to brandish government power to impose their will on opponents. So I stand before you today and I say with great humility, I am the most qualified, the most consistent, and the most proven conservative in this race. And I believe, for the sake of our party and our country, that we must advance a strong national defense, limited government, and traditional values, and those principles must guide our party and our nation as much today as they have for the past 50 years. And in fact, the governor of Florida still justifies using the power of the state to punish a corporation for taking a political stand that he disagreed with. And one of the president's populist protégés actually advocated a 59% inheritance tax in his book, Nation of Victims, last year, saying that Americans should not become wealthy, quote, just by having rich parents. That's liberal redistributionist thinking, not conservatism. And maybe worst of all, Republican populists deny the coming debt crisis facing our children and grandchildren. I came to the Republican Party because of Ronald Reagan. And I remember when I was roughly the age of many of the students gathered here, marveling as his economic policies defeated inflation. His predecessor, Jimmy Carter, had told us that we were a nation in malaise, that we had to accept a new normal of slow economic growth and high inflation. Reagan came in and said, why not dream great dreams? After all, we're Americans. And they cut taxes, rolled back regulations, promoted economic freedom, and America came roaring back. The longest peacetime expansion since the end of World War II. I marveled at the way his policy of peace through strength broke the Soviet Union eventually and strengthened our military as never before. Now, some Republican candidates for the nomination and the populists in our party maintain that Reagan is no longer relevant. But they confuse inspiration with imitation. You know, over 4 decades have passed since Reagan took office, 3 since he left this earth. The great contests of his time and ours are different. In his day, the Cold War between the old Soviet Union and the United States defined global politics. Now the Cold War is long over. During his presidency, our primary rival today, Communist China, was economically impoverished and militarily unsophisticated. We live in a very different time. Conservatives need not replicate every single Reagan policy or strategy, nor should we. But we can emulate his belief in freedom and economic liberty. We can emulate his willingness to stand up to evil regimes on the world stage and stand alongside the friends of freedom across the world. And we can emulate his dignified and civil way of carrying himself as president to meet today's challenges. If we're to defeat Joe Biden and turn America around, the Republican Party must be the party of limited government, free enterprise, fiscal responsibility, and traditional moral values. And I'll be carrying that message across the Granite State and all across America in the days ahead. So with Labor Day behind us, and the campaign for the Republican nomination in full swing, we've come to a Republican time for choosing. Will we embrace the traditional conservative agenda that's led our party and our nation to victory and prosperity now for more than half a century? Or will we choose to go down the path of populism and decline?
So Pence starts his speech with, the usual Biden bashing, he's weakened our country and blah, 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 blah. The typical drivel. And it's kind of interesting because I was thinking back to his ad he put out last month where he was pumping the gas without clicking the amount of gas he wanted. And everybody on Twitter and all over the internet was making fun of him for seemingly not knowing how to pump gas. But it was like, you're running in the Republican primary and you're directly going after the person in the general election and completely skipping over all the people that you're actually competing with currently to talk about Biden's war on energy. And that's the same kind of vibe I had. So like that first 5 minutes, just typical drivel. It's nothing of any importance. But when he talks about, will we be the party of conservatism, or will we follow the siren song of populism unmoored to conservative principles? And he starts to get into this dissertation on populism. That's where we really start to see the cracks, and where much of my high regard for this speech's importance comes from. Because I've said before, a lot of politicians, if they don't have a specific way of campaigning, they act like anyone who does something different has like something wrong with them, or what are these people doing, right? And he tries to conflate populism, which is when people, they campaign a certain style of us versus them. They're taking this from you, I'm gonna bring it back. This is a style that was, and later on Pence is gonna bring up Reagan, but this style of campaigning has been done by members of both parties, including pretty much every successful Republican presidential candidate over the last 40 or 50 years. You had Nixon's silent majority. You had, again, Trump talking about the forgotten man and woman. Our politicians are jokes. He says "are." That was one of his manners of speaking. So what I'm getting at is he tries to take a style of campaigning that has become popular in both parties, but especially on the left. And he mentions, I swear, when he mentioned Huey Long and William Jennings Bryan, I was so surprised, because I've never seen in a modern day, so a speech that has been delivered like since I've been following this stuff for the last 10 years or so, I've never heard anyone mention Long or William Jennings Bryan in any address at all. And it's actually kind of sad, because William Jennings Bryan created the modern style of campaigning, of people going to different states to try to get votes. Because before that, they would just campaign from their front door, effectively like, hey, I'm running, vote for me, and that was it. So he is someone that people should talk more about, and there should be more invoking and discussions of. But I digress. He tries to take this style of campaigning that Trump is doing, that Ramaswamy is doing, and he mentions the two of them, but not by name, and makes it seem as if it is inherently tied to left-wing policy positions when it's not. And I love that he really stresses the importance of this election. The results of this election cycle could determine the fate of our country for years to come. Yeah, they say that every 4 years. And just to kind of display, because one of the themes of this is going to be the state of the Republican Party. But he goes into his autobiography, and he's like, I remember when I first met Reagan during 1988 when I was a congressional candidate, and he does an impression of his voice. It was really weird. And he starts talking about Reagan's record. He, of course, doesn't mention, raising taxes and his much more lax immigration policy compared to modern Republican politicians, because those are the things that would just show that Reagan was more moderate than much of the filth that has come after him. So he makes sure to not say anything about those specific details, because that would mean, highlighting the extremism of the party. My favorite line is, "The truth is, the Republican Party did not begin on a golden escalator in 2015. Now, when he says that, again, he's referencing Trump. and he's trying to say that we were a certain way before, we've existed before him, we'll exist after him, etc., etc. But what he doesn't understand is that effectively the current Republican Party, the one that where Trump is leading by 50 something percent or 40% in all these different polls, that doesn't care if he has 91 criminal charges, they have existed since 2015, and it's almost, and I guess we'll get more into this later, but let me just say the speech has a lot of similarities to the speech that Romney gave back in 2016. It was I believe it was right before the last month or so prior to Trump becoming the presumptive nominee. It was like March of 2016. Romney gave a speech where he was encouraging people to not support Trump. He called him a fraud, all types of stuff. He was more direct, and again, wasn't running against Trump himself, even though some people thought he was going to try to make a break in the brokered convention. But the similarities are there. You have just like Romney, you have a politician who is from the pre-Trump era of the Republican Party that is speaking condemningly of him or his campaign style or speaking style, warning voters not to support him. And just as Romney's speech had no effect on Trump, to where Trump ended up winning the nomination and the general election, it's very likely that Pence's speech will not change anyone's mind about supporting Trump either. And also, both speeches invoke Reagan. At the start of Romney's, he was talking about a time for choosing, and then Pence tried to title his speech on Wednesday after the same 1964 address by Reagan. So that's another thing they have in common. But they're both anti-Trump speeches by politicians who are at the time not in office anymore, but are from the same party, who had been in office before the Trump era started, that are warning voters not to support him anymore or to not back him or whatever. Now let me explain. And look, I'm going to say this again. I think this speech is the most important speech delivered by any politician, either in the Democratic Party or Republican Party, in this entire election cycle, except for maybe Trump's CPAC speech, the one that he gave back in, I think it was February or March, where he was talking about retribution, and this will be the final bout, because it was just this extremely dark, very, like doom type address that was just really painted a revenge type death machine for everyone that he was going to get, some type of grievance with if he won another term. But the main thing to take away here is these are the strongest words that Pence has used to condemn Trump. And it really shows the gap between Republicans who, again, started their careers before Trump and the ones that have come since. Because while Pence is talking about, we need to reject the populism of these new Republican upstarts. Look at the politicians of prominence who have come up in the Republican Party since 2015. You got Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's female Trump, right? You have Ramaswamy, who is praising Trump even though he's run against him, who talks about wanting to pardon him, who adopts a lot of his same positions. And they're all campaigning virtually in a populist manner of us versus them. The system is this. Ramaswamy talks about getting rid of the executive state, etc., firing all these bureaucrats. The point is, the speech is really highlighting of that divide between the old guard and the new guard. And it's so funny, like when Pence talked about Reagan while he was giving his speech, I almost found myself wanting to fall to the floor, because it's like he doesn't realize Republican, like a majority of current day Republican voters do not care about Ronald Reagan. They don't care about either of the Bushes. They don't care about any preceding Republican president or politician. The entire party since 2015 has morphed into a cult devoted to Trump. That's why I say the Republican Party is dead. This is the Trump Party. Because let me tell you something, when you can look at a congresswoman like Liz Cheney, who voted with Trump 92% of the time, but when she deviated from him on the insurrection and said this is something that was immoral, against the Constitution, etc., finds herself walloped in a primary in not only her home state, but the home state that her dad represented and had the same House seat from, you know this is not the Republican Party. Conservative values are dead. Sure, there are, like Trump says he supports them, and but Republican voters, again, Trump party voters, I call them now, make no mistake, if Trump came out tomorrow and said, I am for single payer, I am for free college, we need to give our children higher educate, all of those Republican voters that talk about the creep of socialism and the communist Democrats, they'd be right there clapping for Trump. Yeah. And we know ideology doesn't matter to them because Pence agrees with Trump on pretty much everything. And he's polling worse than, like 4 or 5 people that came out of nowhere? So the speech is going to go down for two. Like if Trump wins this election, if he gets a nomination, whether he wins general election or not, the speech is going to be the representation of the final stand of a politician who came up from like that era where Reagan was the one that everybody hyped up and talked about as being so great and amazing, and who kind of got like surprised by the rise of Trump, but tried to like steer the ship, right? Okay, I'll do whatever he says, I'll agree with him on everything, and then, hopefully it'll be my turn to run in 8 years. And then Trump loses the election, and instead of being a normal person says, oh, it was stolen, I have no evidence, but it was stolen. And then when Pence does something decent for once in his entire career and is like, hey, I'm not about to try to reject votes because you can't accept that you lost, he becomes a pariah in his own party. Again, I don't think this speech is going to change anyone's minds. I don't think it's going to alter the results, but it's unprecedented. Like we were talking about this before. Having a vice president run against the president that they served under, as far as I can tell, that hadn't happened since John Nance Garner ran against FDR in 1940, when Roosevelt was seeking his unprecedented third term. So having a vice president that does that already is historic, but then having that same vice president say, we need new leadership, and you need to reject the president that I served under and actively campaigned for and said nothing but positive things about for 4 years until he turned on me after I wouldn't change the results of the election. We need new leadership, even though my record is entirely tied to it. It is a paradox. Like Pence's role in this election cycle has been such an interesting spectacle because it's this guy who has you have no party. The Republicans only care about Trump, and you're running against him, after you've basically torn all goodwill with him, which means that you're only going to be able to get a solid 5%, 10, again, depending on how many other people are in the race, but you're going to have your ability to get a wide lead or even a big amount of people supporting you already crippled by him denouncing you. And then somehow you think you're going to be able to beat him. So Pence's role in this election was already just like a fool's run, in my opinion. But this speech is significant for the reasons I laid out, because it's very similar to the one that Romney gave in 2016, warning people not to vote for Trump or else they would lose. Except in this case, Pence is warning they're going to lose all conservative values. So it's more of a loss of conservative ideas. Even though Trump was very conservative when he was in office, he had the Supreme Court justice. He appointed these Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade, passed this big tax cut. I don't know what Pence is talking about. But again, because it's similar to Romney's speech, because it shows the gap between Republican politicians who started their careers before Trump and the ones that have come since, and it showcases that the party has truly morphed into a cult entirely associated with one man. So I'm gonna make sure I keep a copy of this speech. That's how significant I think it is personally. You don't have to agree with me, but I'm going to close this out by reading a statement I wrote that I thought would perfectly demonstrate, just be a nice closing statement here. The legacy of the Trump 2024 campaign will be a former president's attempt to win a non-consecutive second term for the first time in over 100 years. The DeSantis 2024 campaign's legacy is waiting too long for your overhyped candidate to formally announce, and the Pence 2024 campaign's legacy will be a vice president being completely overshadowed by the president they served under and rejected by voters, not because his views are too extreme or any different from the president he was in office with, but because he doesn't capitulate to the cult that makes up the party's current national electorate.